Today we have a shocking story about a gold digger, a 50-year-old housewife who is looking for more excitement in life and a gruesome murder. Our story starts on July 4th, 2012. Police receive a call about a disturbance at the master's mansion. The report includes a woman found dead in the pool under suspicious circumstances. What begins as an apparent accident soon turns into a homicide investigation that shocks the wealthy community. In January 2011, Helen Masters, a 50-year-old housewife living in an affluent suburb, walked into an upscale mall, as she often did, when she felt the loneliness of her large, empty home. Her husband, Matthew, a successful businessman in his early 50s, was rarely home, constantly busy with meetings and trips to grow his empire. Though Helen was grateful for the life of luxury Matthew provided, she couldn't ignore the growing void between them. The children were away at university, and Helen's days had become monotonous. Shopping, social events, and charity work could only fill so much of her time. That day, as she browsed through designer handbags, she crossed paths with Troy Davis, a strikingly handsome 20-year-old. Tall, with sharp features and a playful energy, Troy exuded a youthful charm that immediately captivated Helen. She hadn't felt the attention of a man in so long, and Troy's interest in her felt intoxicating. He complimented her on her elegance, and while their conversation was casual, the spark was undeniable. As the days passed, Helen found herself thinking about him often. His presence felt like a refreshing change from the cold, distant relationship she had with Matthew. Within a few weeks, she started seeing Troy more frequently. They would meet in private, at quiet cafes, or during his visits to her lavish home when Matthew was away. Helen wasn't just seeking excitement. She was yearning for the attention and affection she felt she had been deprived of for so long. Troy, on the other hand, quickly recognized Helen's wealth and lifestyle. Her large home, her expensive jewelry, and her constant spending were clear indicators of the fortune she held. He saw an opportunity not just in Helen's loneliness, but in her trust. Over the months that followed, Troy played his role well. He showered her with compliments, made her feel youthful and adored, and allowed her to feel as though she was the center of his world. Helen, blinded by the excitement of her new relationship, started lavishing him with gifts, watches, clothes, and even the use of her credit cards. She was unaware that behind his charm was a calculated manipulation, as Troy slowly drained her accounts without her immediate notice. By the summer of 2011, their affair had deepened. Helen would spend her days waiting for Troy's visits, feeling a sense of purpose and passion again. But she ignored the subtle red flags: Troy's sudden requests for money, his vague excuses for not seeing her as often as he once did, and his late-night phone calls when he was away from her. Helen tried to rationalize it, thinking he was simply busy with his own life, unaware that Troy was spending much of his time with Samantha, his girlfriend, a 22-year-old woman who had been part of his life long before Helen entered the picture. By December 2011, the cracks in their relationship began to widen. Helen, now suspicious, started noticing the patterns she had previously overlooked. Troy's charm was still there, but his requests for cash became more frequent. His excuses for disappearing at night grew flimsy. The thought gnawed at her: something was off. And in early March 2012, Helen decided to take matters into her own hands. She hired a private investigator, someone discreet, who could uncover the truth she feared but needed to confront. It took only a few weeks for the investigator to provide evidence. On March 10, 2012, Helen received a folder of photos and financial records, proof that Troy had been seeing another woman, Samantha. and that they had been working together to exploit her. Samantha was a young woman who lived modestly, but dreamt of the lifestyle Helen led. She had encouraged Troy to get close to Helen, pushing him to gain her trust and extract as much money as possible. The two had already stolen tens of thousands of dollars by using Helen's credit cards, purchasing luxury items for themselves, and covering their own rent and expenses. The betrayal was staggering. Helen had thought Troy cared for her, that she had found a connection she had been missing for so long. Instead, she realized she had been nothing more than a target for manipulation and theft. It wasn't just the financial loss that hurt. It was the emotional devastation of knowing that everything she thought was real had been On July 3, 2012, Helen Masters sat in the living room of her large home, staring at her bank statements in disbelief. Her private investigator had already confirmed Troy and Samantha's plot. But now, seeing the sheer amount of money stolen from her accounts, the reality hit her with full force. She had trusted him, allowed him into her life, and this was how he repaid her. The anger simmered inside her, bubbling up, unable to be contained. She paced the room, trying to control her thoughts, but they spiraled deeper into her betrayal. Later that afternoon, Troy showed up at her door unexpectedly. He had been avoiding her in recent weeks, growing more distant. Helen, furious and hurt, wasn't prepared to see him, but his presence only fueled her rage. She didn't waste any time confronting him. Her words came fast and sharp, accusing him of stealing from her, of lying to her, and of using her for her wealth. Troy, sensing the danger in the situation, tried to calm her down. He explained that she misunderstood, that things weren't how they seemed, but Helen wasn't listening. Her fury had reached a point of no return. The confrontation moved outside, near the pool that stretched across their luxurious backyard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the water surface, but Helen's focus was entirely on Troy. As they stood by the edge of the pool, the tension between them became palpable. Helen's accusations became more intense, her body trembling with rage. Troy's attempts to explain himself grew more desperate, but she wasn't willing to hear him out. It was as if all the months of betrayal had condensed into this one moment, and Helen wasn't holding back. Unable to contain herself, she lunged at him. She grabbed at his shirt, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She wanted to hurt him, to make him feel the pain she had endured. The struggle between them was clumsy, driven by emotion rather than intent. In the chaos, Troy's hand went to push her away, trying to defend himself. He hadn't meant for it to happen the way it did. Helen lost her balance. Her body twisted as she fell backward, her head slamming against the concrete edge of the pool. The sound echoed across the yard, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Troy froze, his heart racing as he watched her body slump into the pool, her limbs barely moving. The water splashed up around her, but Helen, dazed from the impact, couldn't regain her balance. She floated for a second, then began to sink. Troy's mind was racing. He didn't know what to do. He could see the blood from where her head had hit the pool's edge, spreading in the water, but he couldn't move. It was as if he was stuck in time, watching her drown right in front of him. He knew she was in trouble, that she couldn't swim properly, but fear paralyzed him. After a few agonizing moments, her body went still, sinking below the surface, the ripples slowly fading away. Troy snapped out of his shock. He knew what had just happened would ruin him. In a panic, he ran back into the house, scrambling to clean up any evidence of his presence. He wiped down surfaces, collected any items he had touched, and tried to make it look like he had never been there. His thoughts were erratic as he raced through the house, trying to cover his tracks. He couldn't be caught here. It was all self-defense, but who would believe him? The police would think he killed her in cold blood. Before leaving, He looked back at the pool one last time. The water had returned to its calm state, the redness hiding the horror beneath the surface. With a deep breath, he fled the house, driving away as quickly as he could, leaving Helen's body behind. The next morning, on July 4th, 2012, the housemaid arrived at the master's estate. She was the first to notice that something was terribly wrong. Helen wasn't inside the house, but her belongings were still there. Stepping outside to the pool area, the maid let out a gasp at the sight before her. Helen's lifeless body, floating face down in the water. The maid immediately called the police, her voice trembling with shock. By the afternoon, the police arrived at the scene. The officers surveyed the area and examined Helen's body, noting the injury on her head. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident, a fall that led to her drowning. The head injury explained why she was unable to swim to safety, and the circumstances appeared straightforward. But as they began their investigation, they found certain details that didn't sit right. How did she fall? Why was she outside near the pool at that time? The police launched a formal investigation, and by July 6, 2012, they had gathered enough evidence to consider foul play. They started by questioning Matthew, her husband, but his alibi was solid. He had been out of town for business and had witnesses to confirm his whereabouts. Suspicion soon shifted to the people in Helen's life, particularly Troy, once they discovered the affair. As the police pieced together the events, they realized that Helen's death was more than a simple accident. On July 6, 2012, the police continued their investigation into Helen's mysterious death. Matthew, her husband, was one of the first people they questioned. His alibi was rock solid. He had been out of town on business the entire week, with numerous colleagues and clients confirming his whereabouts. The police were initially at a loss. There was no clear evidence to suggest foul play, but something about the case seemed off. As they dug deeper, they discovered phone records that linked Helen to a young man named Troy Davis. Troy had been calling Helen frequently, and these calls continued right up until the day before her death. Even more suspicious were the bank transactions they uncovered. Tens of thousands of dollars had been withdrawn from Helen's accounts in the past several months, much of it going to purchases linked to Troy. The police found credit card receipts for luxury items bought in his name, all using Helen's money. It became clear that Troy had been involved with Helen far more deeply than anyone had first suspected. By July 8, 2012, the police had enough evidence to bring Troy in for questioning. When they confronted him with the phone records and financial documents, Troy didn't deny his relationship with Helen. He admitted they had been having an affair, but he was quick to paint himself as the victim. He explained that Helen had been emotionally unstable, and on the day of the incident, she had attacked him first. According to Troy, Helen became violent when she discovered the extent of his relationship with Samantha. He claimed he had only pushed her in self-defense when she lunged at him by the pool. He insisted that her death was a tragic accident and that he hadn't meant to harm her. Troy's account of the events wasn't enough to convince the police. They believed there was more to the story, especially given his attempts to cover up the scene and flee. His actions after Helen's death, wiping down surfaces, fleeing without calling for help, only made him look more guilty. The police felt confident that Troy was hiding something, and with the financial evidence piling up against him, they moved forward with his arrest. By August 20th, 2012, the case was ready for trial. Matthew, devastated by the betrayal and loss of his wife, used his considerable wealth and influence to ensure that justice would be served. He was not content to let Troy walk away with a slap on the wrist. Matthew hired the best legal team money could buy, and they worked tirelessly to build a case against Troy. The prosecution argued that while Troy may not have intended to kill Helen, his reckless actions had directly caused her death. They presented evidence of the financial exploitation Troy and Samantha had engaged in, painting a picture of a man who had used Helen for her wealth and then abandoned her when she became a liability. The trial quickly became the talk of the town. Media outlets covered every detail, from the salacious nature of the affair to the tragic death of a woman caught in a web of deceit. Troy's defense team tried to plead self-defense, arguing that Helen had been the aggressor and that Troy had only pushed her to protect himself. They portrayed him as a young man who had been manipulated by an older, wealthier woman. But the jury wasn't swayed. Matthew's legal team worked to dismantle Troy's claims. They highlighted his attempts to flee the scene, his efforts to clean up evidence, and the financial trail that showed he had been taking advantage of Helen for months. The jury saw a young man who had lied, stolen, and ultimately caused the death of the woman who trusted him. The emotional weight of the betrayal, combined with Matthew's influence and the overwhelming evidence, made it impossible for the defense to shift the narrative in Troy's favor. On September 10, 2012, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Troy was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a charge that, while acknowledging he hadn't planned the killing, still held him responsible for Helen's death. The judge, perhaps influenced by the tragic nature of the case and Matthew's powerful presence in the courtroom, handed down a harsh sentence: life imprisonment. Troy's face, once so confident, was filled with shock as the reality of his situation set in. He had hoped for a lighter sentence, still believing that his actions could be justified as self-defense. But the court had made its decision. As he was led away in handcuffs, the media swarmed outside the courthouse, eager to capture the moment. 3 years had passed since Helen's tragic death, and the events surrounding it had slowly faded from public memory. By 2015, the media frenzy that had once surrounded the trial had died down, and people had moved on. But for those directly involved, the aftermath lingered in more ways than one. Samantha, the young woman who had once been Troy's partner in deception, had successfully distanced herself from the scandal. During the investigation and trial, she had managed to avoid suspicion entirely. She had been careful, never leaving a paper trail, and ensuring that her involvement with Troy remained hidden. While Troy sat behind bars, sentenced to life in prison, Samantha started rebuilding her life. In April 2015, Samantha married a wealthy businessman. She had always dreamed of a life of luxury, and now, with Troy out of the picture, she found a way to secure it for herself. Her new husband, unaware of her past, lavished her with everything she had desired: expensive vacations, designer clothes, and a lavish home. To the outside world, she appeared to have it all: a young, beautiful woman who had found love with a successful man. No one knew the dark truth of her involvement in the events that had led to Helen's death. Samantha had reinvented herself, leaving behind any trace of her past. She never visited Troy in prison, cutting ties completely. She had no guilt, no remorse. For her, life had moved on. While Samantha basked in her new life, Matthew Masters, Helen's widowed husband, was still picking up the pieces. The scandal surrounding Helen's affair and the trial had taken a toll on him and his children. His once pristine reputation had been tainted by the affair, and the media's relentless coverage of the trial had left deep emotional scars on his family. His children, who were still grappling with their mother's death, had been thrust into the public eye. Their private grief turned into a spectacle for all to see. By May 2015, Matthew decided it was time to move forward. He knew that his children needed stability, and he could no longer manage everything on his own. His work, which had always consumed him, now became his refuge from the painful memories of the past. But he couldn't escape the reality that his children needed more than just a father who was constantly away on business trips. They needed a mother figure in their lives, someone who could provide them with the nurturing they had lost when Helen died. Matthew met a woman several years younger than Helen, a kind and patient individual who understood the complexity of his situation. She had no illusions about filling Helen's shoes, but was willing to help Matthew and his children heal. They married quietly in October 2015, away from the prying eyes of the media. Matthew's new wife brought a sense of calm to the household, but the trauma left behind by Helen's death and the trial still lingered. Matthew's children struggled with the loss of their mother and the shame that followed the trial. They were old enough to understand what had happened, and the whispers from classmates and strangers hadn't gone unnoticed. For them, Helen's death wasn't just the loss of a parent. It was a public tragedy that had marked their lives in ways they couldn't escape. The children had been left emotionally scarred, not only by the sudden and violent way they had lost their mother, but by the intense scrutiny that followed. Their home had once been a place of comfort and security, but after Helen's death, it became a constant reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. The pool where their mother had drowned remained unused, a silent reminder of that fateful day in 2012. Matthew's new wife did her best to help the children move forward, but it was a slow process. She encouraged them to focus on school, tried to fill the void left by Helen, but there were some wounds that even time couldn't heal. Matthew himself tried to move on, but there was a part of him that would always be haunted by the events that had unfolded. The betrayal of his wife, the scandal of the affair, and her tragic death had left a mark on him that no amount of wealth or success could erase. As the years passed, the memory of Helen faded from the public consciousness, but for those involved, the fallout remained. Samantha continued living her life of luxury, never once looking back. Troy languished in prison, serving out his life sentence, left to ponder the choices that had led him there. And Matthew, though remarried and focused on his business, knew that his family had been forever changed. The ripples from that one tragic day in July 2012 continued to affect the lives of everyone connected to it. A reminder that some scars, even when hidden from public view, never truly fade away. The story ends with the haunting aftermath of Helen's tragic death and the impact it has on everyone involved. The trial's conclusion leaves questions lingering about Troy's true intentions, Samantha's role in the theft, and whether justice was truly served in a case tainted by influence and power. This case might leave unresolved feelings in you with the way it ended, but we have other cases where justice was served to the max, like the one where the husband betrays his wife with her best friends and it ends in murder. Be sure to like and subscribe and check it out.